Hi everyone. I'm going to give a demo about the ways to use the UV tools in Maya so you can create your own custom texture maps. So here's the barrel that we made in class, and I'm going to go through two different ways that you can actually UV this. So as I said before, you have to think about a UV map as a 2D representation of 3D space. And if you think about how something like a t-shirt is sewn together and it has seams, your 3D model has to have seams in its UV map in the same way. So when I look at this model, where am I going to cut it? And I can think about this as like, what are the different areas of the model? So I have the outside, I have the inside, I have this little top edge, and I have the top and the bottom of this bottom of the barrel. So those are going to be the different pieces that I'm going to make. And that's just because that makes sense for this model. Depending on what you make, the seams will be in different places. So when you UV, you start off by selecting the faces of the areas that you want to create shells. And I'm going to start off with the outside, and that'll be my first one. So in the UV editor, there are different types of mapping that you can use. And you choose these based on the general shape of the area that you're working with. I'm going to choose cylindrical because this is a cylinder. So choose cylindrical mapping, and it works pretty well right off the bat, but I want to play around with this just to show you what you can do with the tool. If you click and drag on these, notice how it's scaling the UVs in the UV editor. So these are just scaling the size. You want to make sure that the proportions of polygons match your object. If I pull this, it's scaling it side to side. So what are the shape of the polygons? Mine are a little bit more square, so if I actually go like this, it looks like these match that a little better. And I'll show you a way that you can actually check that using a little interim texture. Great, so I think that that looks pretty good. And if I go to UV mode over here, I can select my UVs. If I hold down Command and I right click, I can actually say to shell, and that'll select this entire piece. And I can move it out of the way until I'm done for later. So how do you know that you've done a good job with this? There's, while you're UVing, it's really nice to be able to use a little checker pattern so that you can take a look at how well you've mapped out your object. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So if I go to my rendering menu, I can create a new shader to apply. So I'm going to create a Lambert because that's just a flat shader. It's this middle one that's not shiny at all. And if I click over here, all the way over to the end, I can say, oh look, I have Lambert 2 and it's been assigned to my object. So all the way over to the right in the attribute editor, you can see Lambert 2. And in my color channel, if I click over on the little checker pattern, I can choose a render node to attach to it. And I'm going to choose the checker node. And just don't change any of the settings. In order to see this texture applied to your object, you have to make sure that you're in the view mode that lets you see textures. If I hit number 5 on my keyboard, that's what I'm in right now. I'm going to hit number 6, and it's going to switch to mode where I can actually see the checkers. So I can see on the outside here, the checker pattern, when you look at it, it should be squares. And I'm pretty close. If I go to UV mode and I select this and I scale it, you can see how the checkers are changing. So I want to make sure that they're pretty square because that means that my texture is proportional to the shape it's actually in 3D. Great. In this window, the checker pattern shows up, but it's a little bit distracting and I can't really see what's underneath it. So I'm going to click this button to turn it off. You can click this other one and it'll dim it, but I just prefer to turn it off. Okay, I'm going to select the inside faces and do the same cylindrical map because it worked pretty well. say cylindrical mapping. And now this is when you can really see the effect of scaling your UV tool. It's really great. This looks good. You want the checks to more or less be about the same size, especially for something like this, because then when you're creating your texture map, you don't have to worry about scaling the texture within the texture file. Okay, that's pretty good. So I'm going to come over here, grab my UVs, Command and right click, go to shell, and move it down out of the way because I'm finished with that for now. All right, let's go to the bottom. I'm going to select these faces. All the way around. And for our purposes, it's already UV'd over here, but I want to show you the planar mapping tool, so I'm going to do it again. So I go to UV, planar mapping, and you'll notice that this looks pretty similar to the cylindrical map, but it's in a little square instead of a cylinder, which makes sense. Same thing, if I grab the edges and stretch it, it changes how my UVs are fitting together. So I'm going to leave it about right here because notice my checks are all square, so I know that I've done a good job. Great. Go to UV mode, grab your UV, Command right click to shell. I can move it out of the way. I'm actually going to scale it down a little bit so that my checks are similar in size to my other checks. I'm going to grab the bottom, and after a certain point, I know that this is over here, so I'm just going to grab it. And you can grab the faces over here as well as in your 3D scene, and I think that's a little bit easier. Okay. So I'm going to planar map, and if you actually look in the settings of the planar map, I'm looking straight down at this, so I know I want to project in the y-axis, and that's what this setting says. But if your plane is maybe facing vertically or this way, you can change the direction that your planar map is coming from. If it's at a weird angle, if it's like at an angle kind of sideways, you can choose to project it from the camera. So you just point your camera as best you can at that plane and choose project from camera, and you can project your plane in whatever direction you want. Okay, so I'm going to use y-axis because I still want it to go straight down. Say project. Great, I don't need to change anything except for maybe just scaling it down a little bit. I'm just going to move it over here. Awesome. All right. At this point, it's really helpful to be able to see where these seams are on your model. So in order to do that, I'm going to shift and right click inside of my UV editor and say toggle texture borders. Now I can really easily see where the seams are in my model. So I showed one method for unfolding this top portion in class using the relax tool, but I'm going to show a slightly different one now that I think is actually better in hindsight. So I go to face mode and I select the faces of my model. I'm going to go to my polygons menu and choose the Unitize function. What this does is it takes every face of my model and lays its UVs out to fit this whole square. So we look here, each face has the entire checker pattern as its texture. Now, what I want to do is go into edge mode. I want to select all of the edges, these side edges here, and you notice these are the ones that are connecting all the faces together. So I'm going to select all of them except for where I want my seam to be. And what I'm going to do is sew these back together. So I'm going to take all these faces and choose the sew function so that these seams will be put back together. And I'm going to use this button right here. If you look in the lower corner, it says sew the selected edges together. So I'm going to click sew. Notice here, this is what we got. Okay. here we are. So this still doesn't look like what we want to do, but if I select all of these UVs and I go polygons, unfold, and look at my options, I'm going to choose, so I want to lay these out horizontally instead of vertically. Sometimes it makes more sense to go vertical, sometimes horizontal. In this case, I want to go long ways, so I'm going to go horizontal and say apply and close. If we look at what happened, is it unfolded them, so now they're all straight. And now what I can do here is I can scale this down so it fits inside my texture box. Now it's just a really quick way of taking a curvy object and laying it out in a straight line. As that again because it's such a useful technique, and I'm going to do just a slightly different object, and that's going to be this tube I have over here. So I've assigned my checker pattern to it, and you can tell that it looks very wrong, and that's because it just has these default UVs that are from the original object, and they don't apply anymore. So because my entire object is this curved tube that I want to use the same technique on, I'm going to start off in the same way. So I'm going to have my object selected, and I'm going to say polygons, unitize, and that lays out every face. Its UVs are laid out in this square. Now what I want to do is select the areas of my model where the seam is going to be. So I'm going to choose this edge along the inside. If I double click on it, it takes the whole edge, and the seam is also going to go around there. You can see right there the edge of the end cap. It's going to grab the other one. Okay, so I've selected where my seams are going to go. I'm going to use the command right click tool to go to UVs and say I have my edges selected and I want to change the selection to UVs, just like that. If I hold down shift and drag select over my entire object, it's going to invert the selection. So I just held down shift as I drag selected over my entire object. Now what I want to do is I have all of these UVs selected and I want to sew them together, and in this case we can actually use the move and sew tool. So it's going to sew them all together and put them out in 2D space in a way that makes sense. So move and sew. If we look here, we have this amazing square grid of all the squares of my pipe. But if you look at my pipe, the faces on it are really long rectangles, and these are all square. So the proportions of my UV don't make sense. So I'm going to use the unfold tool to unfold it vertically so that it is the proper proportions. So if I grab my whole object, polygons, unfold, choose the option box, make sure that you're using the direction that makes sense. In this case, we want to go vertically because these are really tall and skinny. And I'm going to say apply. Now if you look, it's laid it out in a way where this is proportional. So I can grab my shell and scale it down so that it fits. Position it. Right here. These are the end caps. And for these, I'll have to do planar mapping. So if I look, I need to get up in that end. Here's a fun trick. It's kind of a pain in the butt to select these one by one. So I'm going to select the ring closest to it, hold down shift and do the period key, or the less than caret, larger than caret, the one above the period. And then I'm going to, so it expands my selection, and now if I contract my selection, it'll just grab the end, because I'm lazy. we go. So I'm going to point my camera at the end of this. Make sure I'm in my modeling menu. Go UV planar, but I'm going to choose my options and project from the camera. Project. Great. Beautiful. I'm going to grab these faces, which are on this end. Point my camera at them. UV planar mapping. Awesome. And now I can grab these two, grab their shells, scale them down. And depending on if I want them to actually have the same UVs or not, I might place them on top of each other or separate. So that really depends on what your texture is going to be. But, okay. The last step of any UV map is to position things properly in this upper quadrant of the UV editor. And there's actually a really fancy tool for doing that that's quite easy to use. And it's just the Layout UV tool. When I click Layout, it just positions everything really nicely into my UV editor so that they're all proportional to each other, because they're all different sizes before, and if I want everything to be proportional in 2D space the same way it is in 3D space. And if I'm texturing this, this is optimizing the space as best as possible. But I can actually space things out a little bit for myself so that it's easier for me later to come in here and change stuff. I'll grab this, move it over a little bit. Sometimes you want to be super optimal, but sometimes you want a little space to work. Okay. What I just showed you was a bit more of a manual way of selecting each area of your model and applying a different type of mapping to it. But if you have a model that doesn't make sense, or you just want to work it a slightly different way, I want to show you that also. So there's this UV tool called Automatic UVing. And basically what this does is, if you select it, Maya's going to do its best to take every part of your model and lay it out as best as it can. And this actually does not a terrible job most of the time, but what you really have to be comfortable doing if you use this is sewing the parts of your model back together. If you notice, I took the entire outer shell of my barrel and kind of split it up, and it was like, okay, so from this side, this piece looks pretty good. This side, this piece looks pretty good. This side. So it kind of looks at it from the 4 sides and does its best to project flat areas of your model. And I think this is great. It made it very easy, especially if my model is more complicated. But what I have to do now is sew the areas back together that are in the same pieces of the model. So let's say that for my barrel, I'm like, okay, great. These are all kind of laid out, but I want to sew the outer pieces of my barrel back together so that I can texture it all in one piece. And so let's do that here. So if I select the edges of this barrel, I'm just going to use the Move and Sew tool. Bam, just like that. And I can kind of stitch my object back together just like this. Sew it. And what's actually really nice about this is that it gets the sizing of your UVs to work out pretty well, but it is curved, so that's a little bit annoying. So what we can do is kind of go in here and lay it out like this, and then we can try the unfold tool, say, hey, lay this out horizontally, and see if, no, okay. In my barrel, in this case, I think it worked a little better to do a cylindrical map, but if your object's a little crazier, maybe this will work for you. So we're gonna go edge mode, and I'm gonna stitch together the inner area of my barrel. So I'm just moving and sewing. It's very handy. Sew here, and sew there. And that was a quick way. I didn't have to use any projection because that's sometimes a little bit overwhelming depending on your model. But using automatic mapping and then sewing your pieces back together can be a great technique. And this was just a really quick demonstration of that. But I would probably do that thing that I did before on this top area to like lay it out straight. But I didn't have to use my projection tools. Maya did its best, and it did not a terrible job. So really quickly, that's just this UV automatic. It'll get you like a running start into UV, and I just want to show you that.